So welcome everybody. We'll give it a few seconds so people can join us. I'm Jenny Bealby from Faithful and Gould, but I'm here in my capacity as Membership Secretary for Constructing Excellence and also the Cambridge-Oxford Corridor CE Club as well. So a lot of you will know me from those events. I'm here as your host today, so I will introduce our speaker shortly and then we can get on with the talk. So just a little bit of housekeeping. There's no interaction verbally on these presentations, but if you open up the chat pane in the Zoom window, you can pop your questions into the chat pane or the Q&A. So we can then deal with the questions at the end of the session. So I can put them to Helen and hopefully she'll be able to respond to some of those. If I just introduce you to Helen very briefly. So as it says on your screen, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, but Helen is Associate Director for Donald Insall from the Oxford office. And I'm sure Helen will introduce herself in more detail. But if I hand over to you, Helen, and we would love to start this very good talk.
Well, I hope not to disappoint. I'm going to talk about the significance of significance, essentially. Significance is a word that you may well have heard when dealing with heritage projects. You may have also heard harm to significance and that sort of thing. And I just want to unpick and unpack those a little bit so that you are better able to understand what heritage people mean when they talk about heritage significance. So hopefully that's what we're going to kind of get to at the end of this session. So just a little bit about me and my background. My background is mainly, as you can see, in the public sector at various different local authorities, and then also at English Heritage, which is now obviously Historic England. I joined Donald Insall Associates in 2013, and in 2017 I opened the Oxford office. I'm also, in my spare time, a director of the Historic Towns and Villages Forum, member of the Oxford Diocesan Advisory Committee, and I'm a former member of, for example, the Marylebone Planning Committee and the Richmond upon Thames Design Review Panel, which are panels and committees that review heritage and architecture and urban design principles of planning applications as they come in. And I'm also an absolutely gigantic nerd about heritage and history and historic buildings and the historic environment. So that's me, very quickly. So just a quick think about the sorts of buildings that we might end up looking at and talking about and having in construction projects. So this is a building at Hertford College in central Oxford, which is listed grade 2 stars, a reasonably sort of innocuous looking building. And you might look at that and think, why is that building significant? And one of the questions I get asked relatively frequently is, why is this building listed? What's special about it? What's significant about it? And the answer is not always completely obvious, but one of the ways that we start to find out and think about what is significant about a building is by delving into its past and researching its history. And the images on the top here are the kinds of images that, if we're lucky, we might find when we're looking at a historic building. And in the top left etching, you can see that there's a representation, and I use that word loosely, of this building sort of in the middle of that slide. It's the bit that's adjoining the building that's turning through a right angle, but it doesn't look very similar to the photograph that you can see. There's also one of the wonderful early maps from the 17th century that survive of Oxford, which show the buildings partly sort of in pictorial form, but also partly in kind of cartographic form. And again, if we're lucky, there might be surviving records of this type that we can look at to try and work out when the building was built, how it's subsequently been altered, and what fabric may remain from those phases. If I could just have the next slide. Sorry, we're having to do a bit of a sort of next slide here job because I can't control the slides from my screen. Anyway, so the National Planning Policy Framework is a sort of critical tool for determining planning applications. And it's through the planning process that we protect and control heritage and conservation and alteration to historic buildings. So there are two different types of alteration to heritage. There's direct alteration, which would be a physical alteration to something, a listed building, a non-designated heritage asset, a building in a conservation area. And then there's indirect alterations, which might be changes to the setting, for example. But it's all controlled through the planning system and through the need for listed building consent or planning permission. And the NPPF contains statements within it on how applications affecting heritage should be handled, and they're at the paragraph set out below. And they have very specific wording in them. And this is why significance is important, because what it says is harm to heritage significance should be shown to be necessary and proportionate to deliver public benefits. So I think what we need to do is to unpack those three things, which are harm, heritage significance, and public benefits. So if we look at the next slide, I'm going to do them sort of, well, this is a sort of graphic representation of what that looks like. So you've got harm on one side, public benefit on the other side, and they sort of run through significance. Those two things kind of connect to significance. So if we look at them in a bit more detail, I'm going to start with the last one, which is public benefits. So what are public benefits? There are some examples of public benefits, and we're getting more examples all the time, but sometimes it's not completely clear whether something is a public benefit or a private benefit or not really a benefit at all. And these things are still sort of in evolution. But in general terms, benefits are to the general public rather than an individual member of the public, and they need to be shown to flow directly from the proposals under consideration. And they could involve, for example, things like landscaping improvements, the fulfilment of other planning policies, for example, the provision of special types of housing or special types of uses on a site. They could be the provision of new public uses, for example, like village centres or public open space. There could be things which benefit the heritage, such as improvements to the inside of listed buildings. So you have to bear in mind that's inherently a public benefit, because listed buildings are protected in the national interest. And therefore, an improvement to the inside of a listed building, even though that can't necessarily be seen by the general public, is inherently a public benefit. And public benefits need to be shown to outweigh heritage harm. But it's probably worth bearing in mind that simply the provision of, for example, new housing, albeit that would correspond to other planning policies, is almost certainly not going to be considered to outweigh heritage harm. So those are the sort of that's the kind of public benefits arrangements. So if we look at the next slide, there's this sort of tricky concept of harm. What is harm? What is harmful? So harm can be direct harm, i.e. knocking down a wall or taking out a chimney piece or taking down the roof. Or it could be indirect harm, which is more harm to settings. So if you've got a nice country house and then you've got a wind farm behind it, that could be found to harm setting. So that's an indirect harm. It could be visual harm or physical harm. So really that relates to direct and indirect harm. But you'll quite often hear conservation officers talking about visual harm, and you think, well, how does it harm the visual side of things? And really that's to do, as I say, with impact on setting and the way in which we view historic buildings and historic areas within their wider setting. It could be permanent or temporary, and even if it's temporary, they could say that's very harmful, even for only a temporary period of time, and that could be enough to sort of stymie things. Critically, in terms of the NPPF, there's this notion of substantial harm or less than substantial harm. And this is a really, understanding the difference between substantial and less than substantial harm is a really important concept. And I always think the best way of thinking about it is if you see harm on a scale, so at this end of the scale, you have absolutely no harm to anything whatsoever. And at this end of the scale, you have the complete destruction of everything that's significant about the place or the building. Almost all proposals and projects will fall somewhere in between that. So if you then say, well, there must be a line between substantial and less than substantial harm, so therefore there must be less than substantial harm over here and substantial harm over here, what you need to do is try and always make sure that your project falls within the less than substantial harm side of things. And then obviously the further down the scale you are, the closer to no harm whatsoever, the less public benefit you have to provide in order to outweigh that harm, if that makes sense. The most important thing though really is that harm is accrued to significance rather than to old fabric in itself, although you may have to argue that point quite strenuously. In my view, not all old fabric is significant, and I think that's, that has been clearly held up. So therefore, not all loss of fabric causes harm to significance. It can't be, because there are lots and lots and lots of applications which are approved, despite the fact that there is some loss of historic fabric, but there's no real kind of public benefits. If you think about sort of internal alterations to a listed house, for example, there might be some loss of historic fabric, but then it's not harmful. The point here is really that in order to understand the case for harm, you need to articulate why something is or is not significant. So understanding and articulating significance is the key to this. So significance. Actually, I'm just going to have a little digression here. This is a house in a village not far from me, and I was most intrigued by it. It's a 17th century house, which has had a mid-18th century pedimented door case added to it. And then somebody in sort of 1810, 1820 has added this rather natty Gothic with a K door case over the top of that. And when I checked the list description, it mentions this in sort of glowing terms and says it's absolutely marvellous, interesting thing, which it is, it's fascinating. But of course, is it harmful or is it significant? And if you and I tried to do this today, if we had the 18th century door case and we said, can we overlay it with something rather funky and glass or something, I don't know, the answer would be no. But of course, this is really interesting because it was done in 1810. So anyway, is it harmful or is it significant? I don't know, probably a bit of both, really. But it raises some really interesting and difficult to answer questions. So if we go to the next slide. So what is heritage significance and where does it come from? So when buildings are listed, there's a formula that the listed, that the designations officer follows, and they've done this for many, many years. And I'm just going to find, so I don't forget. The formula is BDAMP fishes. That's the acronym or the mnemonic that they use, and that stands for building type. So what kind of building is it? Is it a church or a house, etc., etc.? What's the date of it? That's D. Is there a known architect? That's A for architect. Materials, what's it built from? So the house that we were looking at just now is obviously a limestone house, ashlar walls, etc., etc. Plan form, what's the plan form? You can often start to elucidate the plan form from looking at where the doors, the windows and the chimney are, and where the staircase, if you've got a staircase window. What's left in the interior? I is interior. Sorry, I've missed F. F is facade. I is interior. Is there a good interior left? And really, for buildings to be listed today, they would need to have a good interior left. S is special or subsidiary features. H is for history. What's the history of the building? And E is for extra information. I think the second S is just to make it easy to say. So we're really thinking about original fabric and later additions. What's the primary phase of construction and what was added later? And you can think about that as also as older fabric with newer alterations, but it may be that some of those alterations are of significance themselves. So the kinds of things that you're going to be thinking about are the front elevation, what kind of windows you've got, what kind of doors you've got, what is the roof form and material, what's the plan form, what are the stairs like, what are the room proportions, and then sort of special features such as chimney pieces, cornices, architraves, skirts, etc., etc. And another way to think about this, particularly if you're not thinking about a building but about a place, is what makes it unique, cherished, irreplaceable, and gives it its personality. And the two things really need to be an assessment of fabric informed by documentary sources. And then from that, you can synthesize or establish what is significant about the building or the place. So really, who decides what's significant? Who decides what's the significance of significance? Ultimately, if you're dealing with a listed building, it's going to be the conservation officer. However, it's really important, I think, to have your own assessment of significance so that you can lead the debate and have an informed opinion, and also so that your scheme can be informed by that significance, so that you don't get to the point where you think, goodness me, we've got a scheme drawn up in front of us and we didn't realise that these internal partitions were original and it's going to be a problem to take them out. And as with all things, there's no point getting someone to say that something isn't significant when everyone knows it is, because you're going to be shown up to not be really following the best practice. And in my experience, achieving listed building consent is about telling the story in the right way. So how do we do that? What is the right way to tell this particular story? So in order to tell the story in the right way, you start with significance, and then you look at what elements detract from significance. So later extensions, later window modifications or refenestration, addition of cement render, that kind of thing, or alterations to the setting. And then you need to think about, why do you want to do it? Why is it that you want to do this thing, to put this scheme together? Is there a good justification for it? And are you doing it in the least harmful way? The next thing to think about is, what does the local authority want? In any given case or project, there's going to be something that the local authority would like to get out of it, whether that's policy driven or whether that's improvements, or whatever it happens to be. So you need to find out what it is that the local authority want, so that you can try and incorporate that into your scheme as well. Then you need to be able to articulate why this is a good thing for the heritage in general, and you need to reference back to whatever detracting elements there are in your building or site. And then there may be other good reasons to do something, and then you need to look at the policy, planning policy, local and national, and then hopefully out of that sort of sausage machine you will get listed building consent. That is the idea. I'm sure there are people listening who have said, well, I've done all that and we still didn't get listed building consent. So just another sort of little digression. This is this barn actually is 18th century rather than 17th century. That's a mistake, but it's listed grade 2. It's a very handsome building, but actually, if you go on to the next slide, Stuart, some of the most interesting features of the barn is the wealth of graffiti that that we found in it when we were looking at it. And there's the dated graffiti there, EB 1783. There's the interlocking Bs for calling on the protection of the Virgin Mary. There's the tally marks. There's some really unusual horse, what appears to be horse graffiti. And then on the bottom right, you can probably just make out 2 or 3 concentric circles with a dent in the middle with some their petal leaves. It's called a hexafoil or a daisy wheel coming off of it. And these, of course, are not mentioned in the list description, but they're clearly part of the special interest or the significance of the building. Go on to the next slide, Stuart. So it's worth at this point just thinking about what different types of heritage asset there are, because the notion of significance is slightly different depending on what kind of heritage asset you're dealing with. So of course we've got listed buildings, and then we've got curtilage listed buildings. So a curtilage listed building is any structure that is within the curtilage of the listed building and which was built before 1948. So the cut-off date for a curtilage listed building is 1948. Establishing what is the curtilage of a listed building can be quite tricky and has led to some quite interesting kind of court cases and jurisprudence and things like that. But generally, it's to do with historic landowning and possibly landowning at the time of listing. But curtilage can be quite a tricky thing to establish. The setting of a listed building, it's not a designation in itself, but it is referred to in the NPPF as something that needs to be taken into account and protected. We've also got non-designated heritage assets, which is something that was raised by the NPPF. Sometimes they're on a local list. So Oxford, for example, has a very good comprehensive local list, which you can search quite easily. Other local authorities have a local list, but it's not easy to find out what's on it. And quite often, the idea that something is a non-designated heritage asset is brought up at the time that the application is put in, which naturally can cause sort of problems. Conservation areas are another type of heritage asset, and also again the NPPF brings up the setting of conservation areas, which was not pre-NPPF. You wouldn't really have considered the setting of a conservation area. There's also, of course, World Heritage Sites and their settings, and then there's things like maritime heritage, which probably doesn't really affect many of us here, and then scheduled ancient monuments and their settings. So all of these will have different types of significance. So just thinking about those different types of significance, on the top left here, we've got a listed building, which was originally a 17th century house, which was then much altered in the late 19th and early 20th century. We've got a small conservation area, I think is on the plan of the fields, the Google Earth image of the fields. And then on the bottom right, we've got a building which is a scheduled ancient monument and a listed building, which is a crossover that does sometimes happen because of the way that the legislation was drafted in the, well, it was originally in the later 19th century, but then it sort of was altered and amended and changed throughout the beginning of the 20th century up to the sort of up to about 1948. So that's a scheduled ancient monument and a listed building, Carfax conduit. So if we have a look at the next slide. So therefore, what you've got to think about is there's different types of significance according to the different type of heritage asset that you've got. So just looking at two of these here, when you're thinking about listed buildings, obviously there's a significance of fabric and authenticity, and that means that you really need to be able to accurately date the different bits of them. There's the significance of the interior as well as the exterior. There's the significance of curtilage buildings. And then there's the elements of the setting which contribute to its significance. And these could include, for example, designed or incidental views, collections of buildings, and then the idea of a sort of static view as opposed to a view whilst you're moving through the site or moving through an area. Conservation areas are much less about fabric in a way, and they're much more about groups, collections of buildings, the spaces and routes between them, the width and the materiality of those spaces, things like street furniture, features on the skyline, for example. I mean, the Oxford skyline is a really good example of that, heavily protected and quite rightly. But you've got things like church towers, the spires of the Oxford colleges, for example. And then again, you've got elements of setting which contribute to the significance of a conservation area. It could be rural, it could be an urban conservation area, it could be a conservation area where the setting is actually formed by other conservation areas, for example, in central London, where all the conservation areas abut one another. And really, it's about the idea of cherished places rather than the fabric of individual buildings, although that may come into it as well. So this was just a slide demonstrating me assessing the different types of settings of things. So on the bottom right is a 1930s plan of a site in Oxford, where we were looking at what's the significance of the setting of this site and how is it developed. And then the others are site walks and photographs, trying to work out where things would be seen from, and in what context, and whether that would be harmful or beneficial, or how they would interact with one another. So really, what do I think the approach to significance should be? Well, our approach to significance is that it needs to be assessed in the early stages of a project. It's got to be done through thorough research, and that really has to include both primary and secondary sources. Primary sources, I mean by that going to the archive and finding original maps, drawings, photographs, etc., etc. And then secondary sources would be, for example, books that people have written about the place. So Pevsner, the list description, the Victoria County history, that kind of thing. Anything that's been previously published elsewhere. But a lot of the research that we do is primary archival research. And then that needs to be interpreted, which is not always easy. The historic mapping series, for example, is an absolute kind of mine of information, but you need to be able to understand what the symbols on the maps mean, otherwise you can't interpret them properly. It's got to be set against the site surveys. So the research comes first, and then you survey the site, and then you go back to the research to kind of try and figure out whether there are any anomalies, or whether what you're seeing in the documentary evidence makes sense with what you see in the fabric evidence. And then that's got to be followed up with really kind of straightforward advice to the client about what the significance of a site or a place is. So that's really how to prepare a historic building report or a heritage assessment. I won't go through it again, it's sort of repeat of what I've just said, but if you are commissioning them, if you are dealing with heritage significant projects where there's heritage significant, this is what you should be looking for, that sort of level of information. And then this was one of the first projects that we worked on in Oxford, and we found this is 120 High Street, which is now the ivy, so you may know it. And we managed to find some really great pictures of the inside. If you've been inside the ivy, this is looking back towards the front windows, and there was obviously a banking counter. And the really nice thing about that photo is it's got the date, which I think is the 27th of October, but it's also got the time where, if the clock was right when the photograph was taken, it's got the time in it, which is 6:20. So it's quite nice to have that level of information. And then we also managed to find in New College's archives a plan from 1929, which was really kind of key in terms of unlocking what the original spaces were for and how they worked. So you can see, for example, on the left-hand side, the part where the new ivy shop front used to be a music shop, and it had some stairs going up to an apartment, a flat on the first floor. And there was a staircase at the back in the middle, which was lost. So we didn't know how you got from the ground floor banking hall up to the first floor on the right-hand side. If you just want to go on to the next slide. So without wishing to overstate the case at all, understanding significance is absolutely and utterly fundamental to completely everything we do. We can't take forward any project, and neither should you, until you understand the significance of the building and the site. Because without it, the local planning authority in Historic England, and indeed architects who are drawing up the scheme, they can't do their job properly, and neither can we. However, in my opinion, standards are very low in the sector, and I sort of seem to find myself frequently asking conservation officers why such poor statements are accepted. Understanding significance is the key to developing the correct strategy for a site, and in my experience, doing a proper job on it will definitely result in a better outcome for the client and for the building, and therefore for the historic environment more widely. So here's some other, I didn't want the talk to be just all kind of bullet points and talking, so I am trying to include some pretty pictures of historic buildings as well. So top left is the Mitre site, it's in central Oxford. The scaffold not long came down, and it's pretty much finished now after a major kind of refurbishment. And without being able to explain the significance of that building, it wouldn't have been possible to get listed building consent for a lot of the things that we did get consent for there, with TSH acting as architects. And then that's the building that we were just looking at, which is the former Nat West, largely, well, at first appearance, a largely single-phase Victorian building, but actually it had quite a complex evolution which needed to be unpicked quite carefully. It's interesting to think about what the economics of the historic environment are. I mean, there's just a couple of questions there, really. Who has the solution to the investment in the historic environment? The historic environment constantly needs investment because it constantly degrades. You know, old buildings constantly need repair. So who has the solution to investing into these places and buildings? And how do we get the right sort of investment into the right place? And if we have a developer on board, what's in it for the developer, and how do we make sure that they are keen to make this investment? And how do we get the balance right between what the developer wants and what's right for the historic environment? So, I mean, they're all questions, and we could no doubt have a debate about what the answers to those are. They're things to sort of think about, I suppose. And here's another example of why understanding significance is really important. One of the buildings on this farm complex was outside of the village boundary and therefore was not eligible essentially for being converted to residential accommodation. And our research was able to show that it was actually the oldest surviving part of the farmstead that was left. It was a 17th century building, whereas the threshing barn was an 18th century building and the rest of it was 19th century building. So it was the oldest part of the farm. And we were able to argue that if it didn't get planning permission to be converted to residential accommodation, it was just going to fall down. And therefore the sequence of the farm would never would be lost. It wouldn't be properly understood. So that's a really practical example of why research and significance is so important and can actually be so helpful. And here's another example of a rather swanky country house that we worked on a few years ago, where what the client wanted to do was relatively innocuous, but it was difficult to get listed building consent for because my memory is that they'd approached the conservation officer who'd said you can't really do anything, but it's because they hadn't been presented with the information to explain the significance of the building. So that's another example. So just a note really about our clients and who they are, and it's always seemed to me that as much as profit, what developers want is certainty. And a sort of note to conservation officers and local authority staff: developers can cope with a no if it's given in a timely way. Our approach has always been to give completely frank and expert advice about significance and about the chances of getting consent. We like to deal with the art of the possible, but also we're very keen on seeking a constructive approach to finding solutions, because we're very conscious of the fact that the money, the investment that's required is going to come from the private sector by and large. And I think because of that, we're able to have that constructive dialogue with decision makers. This is another project that I undertook a few years ago, whereby the building on the right in the photograph at the top is a listed, I can't remember if it was a barn or a stable, which had been converted to a house. And the building on the left, where you can just see that very long roof, was it was determined that it was a non-designated heritage asset as part of this planning application, and that this is a visual montage for the house in the middle, the sort of long boxy house in the middle. And this is a case where non-designated heritage assets sort of popped up relatively late, before after people had really realized what that could mean. So we were able to show that this new house was not going to cause harm to the setting of either of these heritage assets. It's the sort of thing that you're either going to like or not like. I personally quite like it. I think it's quite innovative. It's obviously of its time. I can understand why people might not be so enthusiastic, but anyway, we did get consent for that, and it was a good consent for the client. So here's just a little diagram showing this relationship between significance, viability, and policy. So viability is key from an investor's point of view, delivering planning policy is key from a societal point of view, and significance is key from a heritage point of view. And they all relate to one another, and they all hopefully engage in a virtuous circle, done correctly. This is another example of where significance is really interesting and important. So we were asked to look at this building and apply for a certificate of immunity from listing. And the building is quite interesting. It's by quite an interesting architect who has other buildings that are listed. He specialised in student accommodation for mainly in Cambridge, actually, but he also did some others in Oxford in the 1970s. The top left black and white photo is how the building looked when it had been first constructed. That was the original design of the building. And then bottom right, you can see that in the 1990s, a pitched roof was added, and these sort of Cotswold vernacular dormer windows were added as well. The pitched roof actually won an award for the best pitched roof of the year. And in awarding this, the judges noted that it had somewhat undermined the original design concept of the building. We really felt that it had eroded the prospect of this building being listed, that these alterations and additions had really made the building unlistable, and Historic England agreed with us on this point. So that's another reason why significance is important to understand. If you're interested in more about how to research the history of old buildings, I've written a small article about that, which is available online. That's my talk. I can't see the chat box, so I don't know if anybody's been asking any questions. I'm hoping that Jenny can tell me.
Well, so far no questions, but I'm listening. Yeah, I'm going to kick off because I've got some questions while people might be thinking about it. So you made an interesting comment actually about halfway through around if you were to get a building listed now, there would have to be a good interior to that building. Yeah. So is it fair to say that some of the buildings that were maybe listed in the, I don't know, 70s, 80s, 90s that were listed on exterior only may not have got through the listing process now?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think it's more probable that buildings, so listing began as an exercise to try and work out which buildings should not be demolished if they were hit by a bomb during the war. That's how listing began. They were salvage lists. They were lists of buildings which would be salvaged should they be hit by bombs. So it's very obvious that there were some really important buildings in central London that, should they be hit by a bomb, don't let them be pulled down. And they needed to have a list to find out what they were so that there were no mistakes made. So that's how listing began. And actually, the grading of listed buildings was based on the university degree system. So you've got a first class degree, you've got an upper second degree, and you've got a lower second degree. So I think that probably tells you quite a lot about the kind of people who were interested in historic buildings in the immediate post-war era. But anyway, that's as maybe. So I think that probably buildings which were listed in the late 40s, 50s and early 60s are probably quite likely to still be listed now. I suspect that there was a period in the kind of 70s and 80s where things were, so there was an accelerated resurvey that began in 1984. And I would guess that probably buildings post that time, which haven't been too messed about with since, probably would, because that was quite, it was an intense period done by professional people who were researching the buildings properly. I suspect that there's a sort of an interim period between the 60s and the 70s where they were, you're right, lots of them were done as exterior only, interior not inspected. That's sort of inconceivable now. It's hard to see that you would get a building listed without access to the interior to understand what it was like. And there are some buildings that I've seen that on the face of it look like really quite interesting buildings, but they've got no interiors left. So we looked at a case recently where the modern listed building by the architectural practice HKPA, and I felt that it was quite a good building and sort of borderline listable quality, but it didn't get listed for two reasons. One, because it had a series of kind of modern extensions, even though actually the plan form of the building had been designed so that it could be extended sequentially. So that was always intended to happen, but the way that it happened was a bit shoddy, and the interior had been really altered. So I think that's what kind of stymied it.
It isn't, and I speak from slightly bitter experience of living in a listed building that hasn't had the interior inspected. So, and I think there was a spate of creating conservation areas and almost surveying a lot of exteriors in order to allocate conservation areas. Back in sort of the late 80s. So,
although just being in a conservation area, the inside of your house is not protected. So the inside of your house is only protected if it's listed. If it's a non-designated heritage asset, or if it's just a house in a conservation area, that only affects alterations to the exterior, not the interior.
Yeah, so complex area, isn't it? Complex.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay, we have got a few more questions as we've been chatting. So Russell Osborne has asked whether you've got experience of needing to do a repair for the protection of a building, only to have a conservation officer say no, or cause delays when they're trying to agree a methodology. What advice have you got?
It sounds like the questioner certainly has had that experience. Yeah, I mean, we do come across that sort of thing. I suppose difficult to really answer without knowing the details of it, but I suppose there's different ways of approaching any repair problem. So I can think of some ways of, repairing a building which would ultimately be quite harmful and which could exacerbate the problems that you're trying to alleviate. And there are some methods which are likely to be much more gentle and long lasting and not cause any problem. Oh, yes, I have, unfortunately. Yes, it sounds like you've got some really bitter experience, which I'm sorry about. Yeah, and that can lead to delay, which can be very, very frustrating. I obviously I don't know. The conservation officer, I have no doubt, is acting in good faith for the building, but it can be very, very frustrating. It sounds to me like, whether it's ongoing, you might need some good advice. I don't know.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And quite often conservation officers are so overworked, it's very difficult to even have a conversation with them, isn't it, in advance? So yeah, it's tricky. Another question from Margarita. This is probably the holy grail, I suspect. Are you ever able to assure certainty to a developer or a client when dealing with a historic building? As in, it must be very difficult.
This is the easiest question to answer. Absolutely never.
Sorry, Margarita.
Never. But I don't think, I mean, a planning consultant could never say you will absolutely get planning permission for this. So, well, I can't think of someone who would say that. No, and one of the things that I generally start off by saying to a client is, I make no promises, I make no guarantees. However, I think this is the best way to approach the problem. I think this is the best way to put your strategy together. And I'm sort of slightly kind of, you know, plugging my own services here, but I think it's much more widely accepted now that you have an architect on a project, you have a planning consultant on a project, and if it's a heritage project, you have a heritage consultant to do that very niche heritage planning strategy for you, to understand significance, to understand opportunities, to understand how to balance that public benefit argument, and then to make those arguments to the conservation officer and have that discussion with them. And I suppose because of my background in the public sector, I understand the language. You know, I speak the same language because I come from the same place. So
yeah,
so
and I think that's
anything, absolutely never.
And you are right. It is the same language you're talking, isn't it? Which makes a huge difference.
That's right. The ones that I can think, well, that's a cracking little scheme. What a great idea! What a great use for the building! How very thoughtful! What a nice, you know, what a cracking death, absolute death knell of a project. If I look at it and think, wow, that's home in time for tea. Yeah.
Lovely. Another question we have got, I can't quite see who it's from actually, so apologies for that. Somebody's saying, thank you for the presentation. Could you give 3 key pieces of advice about managing risk in heritage projects, such as, you know, trying to deal with unexpected delays, issues that you might find? What are your 3 key pieces of advice?
So I think the way that I always look at this is, if I think something is significant, and if I think that what the project team is proposing is harmful, I have to tell them. That's the first most important way that I can manage that risk. If I know that what you want to do is interfering with significance and it's going to be considered harmful, and I don't say anything, I am merely compounding that risk. So if you've got a heritage professional on the team and you think, oh, they're just forever going on about cornices, what's the matter with them? Constantly going on about lime mortar. It's better to look at it and say, actually, they are trying to highlight areas of risk. So I'm not sure I've got 3, but that's certainly, you know, understand significance properly and don't get caught out on the simple significance questions. How old is that bit? How old is that extension? Who built it? What was it for? How is it constructed? What age is it? You know, don't get caught out on those really basic questions, and then think about how you're interfering with them. That's the best way to manage that risk, really.
Excellent. And I think we've got time for one last question before we wrap it up. So Andrew Richards has asked, does heritage and building listing systems apply in other countries around the world?
Yes, they do, but not in quite the same way. So almost every country in the world has some sort of planning system which generally has some sort of nod to heritage. Interestingly, actually, countries which we formerly ruled, countries which were formerly part of the British Empire, after the war, we tended to export our planning system to them. So, for example, in India, they had a very similar planning system, but it sort of never got updated. So it was still as it was in the 1940s. The same in Nepal, actually, because Nepal, it sort of imported a similar planning system. So there's almost always some sort of heritage protection system. In more countries than ours, it's sort of done on a much more local level.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. And actually in France, they developed a system of listed buildings, of listing buildings probably 30 or 40 years before we did. The comparison between the evolution of the 2 different systems is quite interesting, actually, and the comparison between how people got to where they were. I mean, I've done a whole series of talks on the development of conservation planning, which is fascinating, as I'm sure I did say I was a nerd, didn't I? It's my special subject, the development of conservation planning in the UK and how it came about and things. But essentially, it was a sort of war between individual property rights versus a sort of post-war liberal nation, essentially. Giving up those property rights to the benefit of everybody.
Yeah, it probably is. It probably is quite fascinating, Helen. Don't put yourself down.
And it's absolutely, honestly, it's about 9 hours. It's a real.
Okay, maybe 9 hours is a bit too much. I'm going to sneak one last question in if I can. It's come from James at Hawley, and it's quite topical, I suspect.
Okay.
So he asks how open conservation officers are to interventions which listed buildings may need in order to improve efficiencies of the building fabric as we head towards zero carbon.
Yeah, this is a very, very, excuse the pun, hot topic. And it's I mean, the simple answer is a lot will depend on the approach of the council and the individual conservation officer. And it's one of those things where it can be quite hard to predict. I think, understandably, a lot of conservation officers are unwilling to allow coach and horses to be driven through their normal listed building policy in favour of energy efficiency, in the same way that they were unwilling 10, 15, 20 years ago to allow the Disability Discrimination Act to sort of, drive a coach and horses through the protection of historic buildings and places. At work, we have a sort of constant running debate about double glazing, for example. And there are lots and lots of sensitive ways that you can upgrade listed buildings actually without putting in double glazing. Secondary glazing, for example, it's a bit more fiddly to use. It's thermally and acoustically better. And if you've got historic frames or glass, obviously it means that you can keep those, whereas if you replace the windows, you can't. I mean, one thing to think about, of course, is that the number of listed buildings in comparison to the overall building stock is tiny. So conservation officers have been known, it's certainly in my experience, to take the view that why should the listed building bear all the responsibility for trying to reduce emissions when actually nothing is being done to the entirety of the rest of the residential housing stock and that kind of thing. Now, that's fine on a global scale, but when you look at making improvements to an individual building, either for the people who live in it or because it's a development project, that can be quite difficult. I've sort of run away and forgotten what the question was, but I think it was how willing a conservation officer is to sort of be open to this debate. It really varies, and a lot of it will be driven by significance.
Yeah, okay. A long way to go then, obviously. Lovely. I think we'll draw it to a close there if we can. So Stuart has popped into the chat pane the link to the YouTube channel, so you'll be able to see this recording on there again and share that more widely. So please do, and hopefully you've all found it very useful and informative. I certainly have. I've been making some notes. So thank you all very much for attending, and we hope to see you again at another webinar in the future. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jenny.